Hello all, this is Steve from Game & Friends. I'm ranking each game in the Silent Hill series, from worst to best, and I'm going into detail on the elements that work and those that don't. And today, I'm talking about Silent Hill. It breaks my heart a little bit to not rank this game as number one. I played all of the Silent Hill games chronologically, so as the first game I played, I have a lot of nostalgia for this one. It has an incredibly simple and pure premise about it. Later games always found ways to bring you to the town of Silent Hill, but with each iteration, it felt less like a coincidence. With the first game, your presence there was purely incidental. Silent Hill was just a random anytown that you slowly realized had something wrong with it. When it doesn't have the weight of a franchise behind it, that really adds to the mystique of the town itself. Harry doesn't really have a history with Silent Hill. He's just driving through with his daughter when they suddenly skid off the road, and when he wakes up, she's missing. That's all the incentive you need to start exploring, to try and find her and get out of there so that they can get some ice cream or something. On a side note, this is a big issue with the Silent Hill movie. While it's probably one of the better video game adaptations, it's no Oscar winner. And this is part of the reason why. Already, the town is built up as some kind of super mega hell, which makes it feel a little cheap when they finally go there. It's far more satisfying to know nothing about the town and give it the slow burn that it deserves. Give it a chance to properly change from quiet holiday resort to super mega hell. I think anyone watching these videos, anyone who knows anything about the Silent Hill series at all, knows what the number one game is going to be. But that's only when we're forced to rank the games one after the other and reduce it down to numbers. I consider this game and the top ranking game to be very different. It's about as futile as asking which movie is better, Alien or Aliens.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Everybody has a clear favourite, but what your answer will be depends entirely on what sort of experience you want to have. I would always say Alien is better because it's a horror movie with a big focus on symbolism, but I wouldn't begrudge anyone who thinks Aliens is the better movie. It has better quotes, lots of action, and it's easier to watch with a bunch of friends. That's sort of how I feel about the first Silent Hill. It might not be as complex, but I think it's a lot more fun in a creepy, terrifying sort of way. It's more of a straight up horror thrill ride than a psychological burn, like the top ranking game. And if that's what you're after in your game, Silent Hill 1 delivers that very well. Team Silent actively utilise symbolism to get their message across in later games. It's a lot more overt and obvious in the sequels, and therefore easier to pick up on. Silent Hill 1 instead utilises what I call passive symbolism. It might not have been a concentrated effort on the developer's part, but many aspects of the game are very much representative of a strong and depressing theme. That theme is the loss of innocence. It's no coincidence that Silent Hill looks a lot like a town you might see in a 1980 Spielberg film, albeit abandoned. It deliberately evokes nostalgia, calling the target audience's childhood to mind before utterly bastardizing it with demons. Many important locations in the game are traditionally associated with feelings of joy, safety, or curiosity. It takes the familiar and makes it unfamiliar. A classic example of the uncanny. This is something we have seen before at the start of the 1990s with Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet before that. David Lynch is often quoted as a strong influence on Silent Hill, but most people tend to understandably associate this inspiration with Eraserhead rather than his suburban nightmares. These uncanny visuals are somewhat less applicable to Silent Hill 2's Abattoir or Silent Hill 4's Water Prison, where innocence has already been thrown to the dogs. With Silent Hill 1, the series kicks off in the cruelest way imaginable. by denying an innocent child the safety, comfort, and happiness she deserves. This is very much a departure not only from games aimed at children, but also from games as escapist fantasy. This is a game that aims to make you feel bad. While the symbolism does contribute to this, a great deal of credit goes to the game's ability to create atmosphere. The team behind the game showed they were really adept at not just frightening the players, but getting under their skin and making them uncomfortable. You might not be aware, but Konami wanted to make a horror game to rival the Resident Evil games, with more of a Hollywood action movie tone. The team the project was assigned to weren't well known for making successful games, so Konami soon lost faith in the project. This resulted in them paying less attention to the development team, which in turn gave them more creative freedom. They ditched the action movie approach and went for a more psychological route, and produced the game we know today. If the rumours that Team Silent were somewhat neglected at Konami are true, and that seems likely, it would certainly inform the loss of innocence theme the game strives for. Around this time, there was only one other major player in the survival horror arena.
Resident Evil.
Even now, both Resident Evil and Silent Hill are two of the most commonly quoted examples of survival horror. To the untrained eye, there are a lot of similarities between the two, but their differences are far more interesting. If you're familiar with Resident Evil, you'll all remember this moment. In my opinion, this scene with the dogs sums Resident Evil up incredibly well. Lots of silence, then a loud scary bang. And that's not a bad thing, it's something it's really good at. Silent Hill also has a scene featuring a dog, and like Resident Evil, it acts as a neat little summary to the entire game. Whereas Resident Evil builds up tension before relieving it, Silent Hill builds up tension and then pointedly doesn't relieve it. It makes you hold your breath, but doesn't give you the luxury of making you gasp. Resident Evil gave you some rabid undead dogs and almost literally threw them at you out of nowhere. Silent Hill makes you think something like that is going to happen, only to discover they've already been torn apart by something presumably much worse. What's truly scary about this game is rarely what's on screen, it's what goes unseen. When you think of the best parts of Silent Hill 1, it is just about impossible to exclude the opening. The alleyway Harry walks down is exquisitely designed and one of my favourite openings to any video game ever. Aside from the very unsettling things he finds there, the way the camera moves or the light works are just exceptional. This angle is commonly referred to as a Dutch tilt and is often utilised by acclaimed directors such as Terry Gilliam or Adrian Lyne to give a sense of unease to the audience. Combined, the overall effect conveys a sense of claustrophobia and of being watched at the same time. There are a few other occasions of this happening in the game, but this is the most memorable. These techniques are sometimes used in films. In particular, I feel as though it's reminiscent of the opening of the film Halloween, when we see through the eyes of Mike Myers before he murders his sister. There, we are placed in the uncomfortable position of murderer as he stalks his victim, and then during the murder itself. Here, we are given a similar sensation, but as is the case with the dog, there is no relief. The monsters who attack Harry are minions, whereas the person watching is never revealed, unless it is the town itself that is watching. One of the best things about this opening sequence is that it implants a sense of confusion and dread in the player for the rest of the game. In these moments, you should feel genuinely uncomfortable and scared, and ultimately, it results in you dying. It's not permanent, but you get attacked and you die, before waking up in another area. The fact that this happens during gameplay and not a cutscene is incredibly important. It breaks one of the most basic rules that was set by almost every game before it. So long as you don't die, you have the potential to progress. Here, you need to die in order to progress. It wasn't until my 4th playthrough of the entire game that I realised you can't escape from the alleyway or win against the monsters. Doing this at the very beginning of the game pulls the rug out from under the player. Every subsequent occasion where you find yourself trapped by an enemy and start to panic feels like an echo of that moment. It plants the suggestion in your mind that perhaps you are being attacked because there is no way out. Maybe the odds are stacked so unfairly against you because death is simply inevitable. It makes the final moment before you die absolutely heart-stopping because it makes you question everything. It makes you question whether you could have run a little faster or could have fought a little harder if you didn't have that momentary self-doubt. It makes you question, just for a second, whether you are doing the right thing in trying to stay alive. Causing a player to doubt their own survival instincts in a survival horror game is just about the cruelest trick the developers could have played. In terms of flaws, the only major gripe I have with Silent Hill 1 is down to pacing. The first major area you need to explore is the school. The school is a bit of a double-edged sword because, on the one hand, it's easily the best area in the game. It's got a lot of creepy imagery that brings to mind a loss of innocence, it's a particularly big area, and it's a lot of fun to explore, if you can call it fun. It also ramps up the tension considerably after having explored the misty streets of Silent Hill at a comparatively relaxed pace, only to enter a pitch-black maze of sorts. Unfortunately, most of the subsequent areas, although also pretty excellent, can't really live up to it. There's no way a sewer level is ever going to be as interesting as an abandoned school with ghost kids wandering about and creepy cats in lockers. Luckily, the quality picks up again once the player gets to the carnival location, and it maintains that level of quality until the very end. That was actually a smart move on the developers' part, I think. If they knew they were going to run out of time or money at some point, I'm glad they spent the most of their resources on the beginning and the end of the game, which are the two most important parts of any game. It sucks the player in first, and then leaves them with a good impression at the end. When you look at it that way, it can only really be described as a success. While the pacing might be an issue, one thing I like about the locations you visit is how much sense they make in the game and to the story. Something you don't realise until the end of the game is that Alessa is trying to tell Harry what happened to her in her previous life. But she can't cheat. She can't just appear and spell it out to Harry because obviously he'd never believe her. He's got way too much going on to try and process ghostly teenage angst as well. As well as that, if she did appear and explain everything, that'd make for a pretty short and pretty crappy game. Instead, she guides him through her life, so it makes sense to go to the school she attended. It makes sense to go to the hospital where she was a patient. Even the carnival and antique shop makes sense, because these are all the types of places Alessa would have spent time in as a young child growing up in a small town. Even the sewer level sort of makes sense here, because when describing it, the character of Lisa makes a point of saying the entrance is near the school, and had to be fenced off to keep people out, so it could very easily have been somewhere kids went to play. We all know what a kick kids get out of playing somewhere they know they shouldn't be. If you were to suddenly play this game for the first time after watching this video, presumably because some guy with a sexy Irish accent got you hooked on the idea, you'd probably notice that the graphics are a little bit wonky. It sort of looks like lumps of Play-Doh acting out a play written by H.P. Lovecraft. In my personal opinion, this works in the game's favour. Consider the medium of claymation. Claymation is an inherently creepy medium. Look up claymation horror on YouTube and just see how many short, disturbing films you find. It's one of the reasons the film The Nightmare Before Christmas works as well as it does. Imagine that film had simply been a 2D animated feature or a live action feature. It would have either looked really childish or just plain ridiculous. Claymation is otherworldly because the clay gives us something that seems tangible, real, and familiar. But animated clay is unnatural, peculiar, and strange. It lends itself perfectly to horror. This is the sense I get from the first Silent Hill, as I see big, blocking nurses lunging for Harry in dark corridors, or skinless dogs attacking him in the misty streets. Even without the narrative, atmosphere, and actions themselves, it would still seem bizarre and surreal because of the way it looks. Additionally, the poor graphics complements another aspect of the game that, theoretically, could be seen as a flaw: the draw distance. I mentioned in an earlier video that the reason the mist was included in Silent Hill 1 was to hide the fact that it couldn't render a lot on screen at one time. When mist was impractical, they used darkness instead. It speaks to the strength of the development team that they took a problem they encountered during production and not only resolved it, but turned it into the series' biggest strength. Later games have included the motifs of mist and darkness as well, but this wasn't as necessary as it was in the first game. From a gameplay perspective, it adds to the player's general confusion, constantly making them feel lost and disoriented. It also contributes to the sense of claustrophobia mentioned earlier, often making you feel trapped. And as well as this, it has profound implications on the narrative, depending on how much you read into it. The worst ending of the game implies that Harry died at the very beginning of the game, and Silent Hill is his hell. In recent playthroughs, whenever I think of this, I constantly find my eye drawn to the edge of the draw distance, to where the dark or misty nothingness begins. I first did this in the final area, which, because it's a collage of previous locations, it defies dimensional space anyway. With that in mind, I found myself thinking, wow, there really is nothing past what I'm seeing. Harry is essentially trapped in nothingness, in an isolated dimension of despair. When you consider the fact that nothing is actually rendered past the player's vision, then the poor graphics feed into a profound state of existence for the protagonist. This method of interpretation harkens back to the concept of the death of the author, in which a piece of writing and the author are seen as completely unrelated. As a result, the creator's intentions are not taken into account when interpreting a text, or in this case, a game. With that in mind, it makes sense to view Harry as being stuck in a low polygon limbo. It doesn't matter if it's not the intention. Whether Team Silent were trying to convey this or not is irrelevant. It's there regardless of whether they want it to be or not. For me, the limitations of the hardware actually do feed into the very concept of the limbo that Harry is experiencing, which makes him utterly and totally alone. Just a thought. The first Silent Hill game has a special place in my memory because it introduced so much of what made the Silent Hill series special. It popularized a particular brand of horror that I craved, a slow creeping dread that managed to get under your skin even after you turned the game off. It does have its flaws. The pacing isn't as tight as it should be, and there's an argument to be made that the graphics don't hold up very well. And because the themes and symbolism aren't as overt as in later games, it could be considered less ambitious. Nonetheless, this is a game that pioneered psychological horror, and the amount of innovation on display here cannot be understated. Through thoughtful enemy design, strategic use of location, well-directed set pieces, and technical wizardry, the first Silent Hill deservedly established itself as a name synonymous with survival horror.